Are you ready?
Oh, yeah!
From parts unknown and into your home, this is the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. Now, here's your host, Groovy G.
Hello there folks and welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. Now it is very rare to come across an expert who has literally written the book on a subject, but that's exactly what my guest on this episode has done. I'm talking of course about the author of the 10 Pounds of Gold and the Big Gold books, Mr. Dick Bourne. He's coming your way right now.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovygshop.com.
Mr. Dick Bourne, welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Grant. Thanks very much. I appreciate you having me on. I'm looking forward to talking belts with you a little bit.
Now, when and how did you get into professional wrestling?
Well, I mean, like most of us probably as a kid, I was aware of pro wrestling like other sports from probably, 7 or 8 years old, but I didn't get hooked on wrestling until I was around 13. And I guess, again, like most of us, it's usually a match or an angle that gets us hooked. And for me, it was in 1975 in the Mid-Atlantic area here in the United States where Paul Jones and Wahoo McDaniel were the top two baby faces, and they had formed a team and defeated the Anderson brothers for the World Tag Team titles. And on television, the Andersons got a shot back at those belts, and it's a long, sort of drawn-out angle, but the short version is that Ole Anderson sacrificed his brother by throwing Wahoo McDaniel into his brother, and their heads collided, and both were knocked out, and Ole Anderson covered Wahoo and they won the titles back. And that just blew my mind as a kid. I was like, that one brother would sacrifice the other and to win the titles back, to get those belts back. Ole always put the belts over is the main thing. And that's what got me hooked. And from that point forward in the spring of 75, I don't think I missed Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling television show for the rest of its run into the late 80s.
And were those tag team belts, were they your favorite belts, or did you have other favorites growing up?
They were a part of a group of favorites. I guess my favorite all-time belt, especially from a territory standpoint, is the United States Championship belt that was used in the 1970s there. It was on a piece of red leather and was shaped like the United States. And for whatever reason, that was kind of the belt that got my attention. I also loved the NWA World Title belt that Harley Race and Jack Briscoe and Ric Flair, Terry Funk, all those guys held, and was kind of the subject of my first book. And then I would throw the tag team belts. Certainly that version of the tag team belts, which were sort of more of a throwback to the design of the belts at the time. Later on, there were different versions, as there are with all belts. But yeah, I would put those in that grouping of my favorites, those three.
And I guess at that sort of time, that was the in-between. They were using those trophy style, they were those Malkovich belts, and then they started using the Reggie Parks belts not long after that as well too. So I guess you got to see the best of both worlds.
That's right. And then in the middle of that, for a very short time, and I've never known the reason, just never been able to come across the reason, there was a version of the World Tag Team belts. I think they were called Levy belts, made by Levy, that were on a blue strap. And they were only used for maybe even less than a year, and only two teams held them around, I don't have the date right in my head, but it was 78, I think. And there were three different versions. The original Reggie Parks belts that started in 75, then the blue belts, then they went back to the Parks belts, and then the cast belts that were used. I think more people remember those big Eagle cast belts that were used on through the 80s to the end of Crockett Promotions.
Now, you mentioned your first book briefly, the 10 Pounds of Gold. How did you come to write the 10 Pounds of Gold book?
Back in 2008, Michael Bakikio, who runs High Spots, was doing some business with Ric Flair at the time, and I knew that Michael briefly had possession of that belt as they were taking it kind of on a tour of shows where Rick would have his photograph made with it with fans or whatever. And so I asked Michael, was there any way he could get with Rick to arrange for me to be able to photograph the belt? And, of course, my buddy Dave Milliken was interested in that, too. And really there was no thought of a book at that time. I just wanted to see this kind of holy grail of belts up close and be able to take some good photographs of it, really more from my website is what I planned on. And Michael was great and was able to work it out with Rick. We had to pay Rick a little fee to have access to it, but then Rick pretty much let us do what we wanted, and it was framed, and we took it to the person that framed it to get it out of the frame for us, and then we spent the better part of a day taking pictures and just kind of marking out over being able to hold that belt and look at the belt and so forth. And after we had all these great pictures, you know, we wanted to share them, and I wanted to do something more than just put them on the website. And we got to kicking it around and thought, well, why don't we do a photo book? And I didn't know anything about publishing at the time, self-publishing, or even how to put together a book. But I started looking into it, and really the first version of the book, which was a hardcover 8x10 format book, was really more of a photo book. And that, even though it was very expensive because it was hardcover and full color, those are expensive to produce on a small run, it kind of took off, and so I decided to do a second edition of the book that was not as expensive to either produce or buy, and add a little more information about the history of the belt, how it came about, and the title history, things like that. And that's the book that's available now. It's a soft cover book and a little bit smaller, but it's available in full color and black and white, so you can still see the beauty of the color of that belt. But that's how the book came together. I mean, it wasn't originally planned. We just decided to do it and thought there would be other people interested in the history and how the belt was put together, because it was so different from belts today, you know, how it was constructed. And it just kind of took off from there.
Now, the book covers a whole lot of details. What was it like for you as a fan, uncovering all of that history?
Well, my mind was blown. I mean, Dave already knew a lot about the belt. Anyway, he knew who had made it. Dave's just like, you know, an encyclopedia on this stuff. And obviously, as a belt maker and the premier belt maker, I mean, he has a lot of interest in that history. But so he already knew a lot about it, and he knew that it had been pieced together by a jeweler in Mexico, but we had no idea really the amount of pieces that there were and how it was put together. And so when we actually had the belt, and it was it wasn't in terrible shape, but it was pretty banged up after all those years, and the leather was separating from the plates a little bit on one of the edges, and you could just pull that leather back just slightly and see inside between the leather and the plates, and I think we've got a picture of that in the book, and you could just see all these, what looked to be hundreds of screws. There probably weren't a total of 100, but there were probably 80 or 90 that were attaching all these little bits and pieces of that belt to the main plate, and that was kind of a surprise just to see exactly how that was done, and the craftsmanship of each of those pieces. And for instance, what we called the beads that are around the outside of the plate, how carefully those were made and how much they were like each other. The exactness of the detail of those was just amazing. And then there were other little surprises, like you mentioned to me in an earlier email. We were talking about the Kerry Von Erich initials that were scratched onto the belt, looked like maybe by a pocket knife, and that was a little detail that David discovered just looking closely at it, and then we were just kind of freaked out by that. I mean, obviously, for Kerry to do that, it must have meant a lot to him to hold that title, and he wanted to leave his mark on it, even though he held it for a short period of time, and he certainly did, because it's still on there today. It's very hard to see, and we had to keep tilting the belt when we were taking pictures to get it to show up, and finally we got the light just right. It just kind of jumped off there, and so the KVE shows up in most of the pictures that we have in the book if you look closely.
Now, is it true that Ric Flair himself didn't actually know that Kerry had engraved his initials into the Dome Globe?
Yeah. Yes, I don't think anybody did. I mean, we'd never heard that before, and I really do believe Dave Milliken was the first person to discover that or see it. At a FanFest event in Charlotte, right after the first book was published, Rick was doing a Q&A with Harley Race, and the Q&A was actually focused on the Starrcade 83 event where Rick defeated Harley for the title the second time. And a fan who had bought the book asked that question to Rick in the Q&A, and so it's a room full of people, and Rick just totally thought the guy was nuts and pretty much blew it off and said, you know, if Kerry's initials were in that belt, I would be the one to know it. And it was kind of a funny moment for us because it showed that Rick had never noticed that before. And so later on in that same day, after that Q&A, Rick and Harley Race were doing a photo op with the belt, and you could have your picture made with Rick and Harley and the belt, which was in the case. And that fan pointed it out to Rick, and Rick looked at it and just smiled and said, "Well, I've never noticed that before. I apologize." He apologized to the fan because he kind of made fun of the fan on stage. But it was kind of a neat moment because it showed you how even Rick, who had that belt longer than anybody, that particular one, I guess, or maybe he and Harley equally, they'd never noticed that. And so that was kind of a cool moment. But yeah, Rick had no idea until that fan fest in Charlotte.
Were you surprised by the success of that book?
Yes. Well, I mean, I didn't have really any expectations for it one way or the other. You know, Dave and I just knew we were interested in it, and we knew of, I mean, he had been involved in some of the message boards like Belt Talk and some of the other places, and there was obviously a lot of people who had this interest in belts in general. And so we knew people would be interested in seeing very detailed, you know, up-close photos. And then that book was really only available through my website and through Dave, and we were kind of selling them individually. High Spot sold them. And then I did the second edition, which we made available through Amazon, and that's where the book really took off. Amazon just makes the world a smaller place, making things available. And so, yeah, I was surprised, and it's continued to be popular. And as I've published additional books on the Big Gold Belt and some other things, each time I do that, it kind of regenerates, if that's the right word, probably isn't the right word, interest in the 10 Pounds of Gold book, which was the first one. So it's continued to do pretty well, and I'm thrilled by it, and it's fun to share some of that opportunity that Dave and I had with others.
What do you think now about the Dome Globe, the 10 Pounds of Gold, being in the hands of the WWE? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. And the reason I say that is, number one, and some of these things I'm going to say are my impressions of the situation, but also what I've been told by other people that know. But Triple H, Hunter, is very respectful of that belt and very respectful of that time period. And it was the wrestling that he grew up watching. And so by the WWE having it, I believe it will always be safe, and there will be opportunities for fans to be able to see it one way or the other. It was available at least once, and I think twice, at, I believe it was available during Access. I know it was one time as part of a big display. And so the world's able to see it that way. And granted, that's not very often that that's going to happen, but I guess it's better than maybe a private collector having it and no one ever being able to see it. And even if it were well taken care of, but knowing now that it's, you know, and they talk about a physical Hall of Fame at some point. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but perhaps it would be on display that way. So I'm fine with it. I think there are people in that organization who have a great deal of respect for that time period, and they'll take good care of it, you know, for generations to come, I hope.
Now, the Dome Globe was actually probably one of the most recognizable championship belts in wrestling history, so I guess the next progression after that would be the Big Gold Belt. How did you come across writing a book for the Big Gold Belt? Was that requested by fans who had read your Dome Globe book, or did you just think that's a natural progression? People obviously like the Dome Globe book, so let's do a Big Gold one.
Well, I mean, we kind of stumbled onto that as well. I met the person who owns that belt now, a private collector, and I think a lot of people may have an idea of who that is, but I won't either confirm or deny
Yeah.
to respect his privacy. I mean, a lot of people have written and asked, is it this person? But same thing kind of happened. I met that collector and asked about taking some pictures, and one thing kind of developed into another. Once I guess the one thing that happened that led to writing the book or putting the book together was on the back of the leather was a stamp by the company who made the leather for that belt. So I just started Googling the name that was stamped into the back of the belt, Harris Leather, and found out that they were located about 20 to 30 miles from me. I'm in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and they're in State Road, North Carolina, which is about 20 or 30 miles from where I am. I just couldn't get over that, so I called and asked about it. Sure enough, they confirmed that they had made the leather for the belt and started telling me that story, some kind of funny things about that story. So once I kind of had that, and we kind of knew the history of that belt, Dave knew who had made it, and that wasn't a real secret. And then we were able to get some of the paperwork supporting the actual making of the belt by the company, some of the paperwork that existed. So I decided, I started thinking, well, there'll be an interest in this too by the same people who were interested in the 10 pounds of gold of the Dome Globe belt. This ought to work as well. And then it just grew from there. I mean, when I went over, the people at Harris Leather were so gracious to share old pictures that they had made when the belt was made. And it just kind of took off from there. And then we were able to interview people at Crumrine, the jewelers in Nevada, who made the belt. And just one thing added to another. It made sense to try to do a book there. And I actually think that book is probably more interesting just because of the little goofy stories that surround parts of that thing coming together. And then finding the original leather, interviewing the people who did that. I mean, it just all came together and made for a more, total package of the story behind that belt.
So without giving the whole book away, because it really is a great read, and any belt fan, I think any wrestling fan would really get a lot out of it, you really did uncover a whole lot of new things about the belt's past. You mentioned before about the leather, but also from the Crumrine, the nameplates and some of the designs that went into it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like I say, the book itself is a more complete picture of that belt than even the 10 Pounds of Gold book is. And to be able to interact, like, for instance, there was no way to figure out how, I doubt if Manuel Sabala is still alive, the jeweler that made the 10 Pounds of Gold, but without any way of trying to figure that out, we were able to talk to all these people in the process, including, Nelson Royal was the one that actually, the wrestler Nelson Royal, who worked for Jim Crockett Promotions, was the person who was able to kind of put together the deal with Crumrine to make that belt. They were a jeweler. They didn't make wrestling belts. And so Nelson, of course, has long since died, but I was able to talk to his son, who it wound up being. He was the sales rep for Crumrine in North Carolina, and that's kind of how that connection was made and how Jim Crockett was able to get a good deal, a relatively good deal on paying for that big silver buckle. And each piece along the way just opened up a new door and a new story. And we were able to find out about how the thing was actually hand engraved and who the actual engraver was that worked for Crumrine. All those details are laid out in the book, everyone that we could dig up. I mean, we had people that were so interested in that belt. Conrad Thompson, for one, was able to give us some information on things that I never would have figured out about little markings on the belt and what angles that came from those in the WCW storylines in the later life of that belt. So little things like that. Just to me, it's the details that are fascinating. And so we had so many little details about that belt and how it came together. Even talked to the guy who delivered the belt when it was leathered back to Jim Crockett Promotions, and the story about meeting them in the parking lot and all that. So little details make the story more fun.
What do you think is so enduring to wrestling fans about the big gold belt? I mean, it lasted the entire run of WCW. It was used in Jim Crockett Promotions before it became WCW, and then it was even used by the WWE. Well, a cast copy was after their takeover. So what's so enduring about that belt?
I don't know. I think it was so different looking, and this is just my opinion, I mean, than all other wrestling belts, certainly in the era in which, when it was first debuted or presented in 1986, it just was so ornate and special looking, and somehow that connected. It was during the Four Horsemen period that it was used, and that was such a identifiable period that fans attached themselves to Jim Crockett Promotions as far as interest on a national scale. And then when Crockett sold his business to Ted Turner, they continued to use the belt. It was recognized in Japan for a brief period of time. It was defended there when Great Muta held it and so forth, and they brought back the NWA at that time in the early 90s. And then the transition from Turner to WWE, and I just think, again, some of the people that are responsible in management and running the WWE grew up seeing that belt, and so that design, which had been popular, just continued. And yeah, you're right. I guess it went all the way to Brock Lesnar was the last one, I guess, to hold that image of that belt, and the WWE went to this new design with their big logo on the front of their belt. And we haven't seen the big gold, I guess, since. But, it wouldn't surprise me at some point in time if they didn't try to bring that back at some point, because it is such an identifiable symbol. And it does, like you just said, it spans kind of two generations of wrestling fans.
Now, the big gold is in the hands of a private collector. What are your thoughts on that? He does lend it out to the WWE for those access shows. What are your thoughts on it being in the hands of a private collector rather than the WWE?
Well, as a private collector in general, that can be scary sometimes, because fans and the public might not ever get to see it. In this case, though, the person that does own that belt has been very generous to allow both WWE and some other promoters to use the belt in a positive way, either with Ric Flair or other champions that held it for photo opportunities and things like that. So, I'm thrilled by that. And personally, I could not be more grateful to have been allowed to have access to that belt and be able to do the book and learn so many things that we didn't know and putting that book together. Again, I'm kind of the one that steered the book project, but both of those two books could not have been done without Dave Milliken, and he already had so much knowledge about those belts before we even got started. And then, like I say, each one just fed off, or each bit of information fed to the next bit, and we were able to put together the story. But because this collector has been so forthcoming and letting the belt be used, man, I'm thrilled to death with it, and I'm glad people get to see it. I mean, to me, it is also kind of like one of those holy grail type belts. Sentimentally, the Dome Globe will always be my favorite, and when directly asked, Ric Flair has answered that question the same way, because it represented the NWA at a time when it was truly worldwide and defended in Australia and Japan and Hong Kong and places across the outside of the United States, as well as the territories. So that's kind of my sentimental favorite. But the big gold certainly is by far, I guess, the most recognized belt in the world historically. I guess the current belts might be that way too, because of the WWE logo that's so big on the front of them, which I don't particularly think is all that attractive, but they certainly have branded their logo well on those belts, that's for sure.
That's what I was going to ask you. What do you think of the current designs that are used by the WWE or TNA or the UFC at the moment?
Well, I'm not as plugged into wrestling as I am the old stuff, today's wrestling, but I don't particularly like the design of their top belts, the WWE, the SmackDown and Raw belts, or the women's belt. I mean, they all kind of look the same. They are different colors. I know the colors represent the brands. I understand what they're doing there. But just to have their logo that big on the belt, there's something that doesn't make sense about that to me, although I understand why they do it. I mean, they're branding their business for a worldwide thing, and they want to make that brand logo very recognizable, and they certainly have been successful in that. So I respect their business part of that, but from a belt standpoint, a creative standpoint, I don't really personally like it. I will say, though, I like the NXT belts because they don't, I mean, I say that and I realize the NXT logo is branded real big across that, but it's somehow just not as gaudy as the WWE belts, if that's the right word. I love the North American title design that they just, that new belt in the last year. So I somehow know that the NXT belts kind of have a better look to me than the main roster belts, but that's just my opinion.
Now, you mentioned the NXT North American title. That's on a red leather strap. That might be a little bit of a throwback to the Nikita Molkovich, the cast NWA United States belts, perhaps. Your next book after the Big Gold book was about the actual NWA United States books. How did they come about?
Well, after both of the books, and especially the Big Gold has been was more successful than the 10 pounds of gold, and I think it goes back to what you asked earlier about that belt being, you know, so widely appreciated and remembered and so forth. But I kind of got the book bug. I wanted to do some other projects. I've been doing the website for almost 20 years now, but the book projects were a way to get much more in depth on things that I was interested in. And I've really never done books thinking of broad. I mean, my books are very niche in their interest, and in order to do them, I kind of have to have a real passionate interest myself. And so I decided that I was going to try to do a book on every Crockett title from the 70s and 80s over time. And I've completed the first one of those, which was the United States Championship, and I'm currently working on another one now on the Mid-Atlantic Championship. But those books are more, I consider them more history books than belt books. Now, I do go through each of the 5 belts in the case of the United States Championship, each of the 5 belts that were used and who made them and so forth, and which champions held them, and talk a little bit about that. And again, Dave Milliken was helpful to me on that. But the primary focus of that book is the title history and how it weaves through each of those 5 belts. And the same will be done on the Mid-Atlantic title. There were 4 belts used for it, and I plan to do something. I'm working on that now. Don't know when I'll be through with it, but I'm hoping to have it out this year and or maybe this summer even, and it will be very similar to that United States Championship book.
Now, your interest is in Jim Crockett Promotions and the Mid-Atlantic area in particular, and you just mentioned that these books come from your own interest. Would there be any way of swaying you into perhaps thinking about doing a WWF title belt, a book on one of them? Because I think there's to be some fans screaming out for a book on a Winged Eagle title, perhaps.
Yeah, I have been I got a lot of feedback from the Belt Talk board when the Big Gold book came out. People that did, it made me feel good that people appreciated that book, and people would suggest, why not a book on this? Because every group of fans has their own favorite. Well, every person that's a fan of belts has their own favorite belt, and the Winged Eagle certainly is the one that I heard the most about from people that would love to see a book on that. I'm not the person to write the book. My real fun in these books, the fun that I have, is the creative aspect of putting the book together, formatting it and finding the photos and things like that. But that wouldn't be me. I mean, I have a great appreciation, and the Winged Eagle belt is my favorite of the WWE title belts for sure. I have a great appreciation for other belts, but I don't have the interest in researching and doing the writing about it, if that makes sense. My interest is sort of in the Mid-Atlantic area, the area I grew up in, and that's what I want to write about and research personally if I'm going to spend the time doing that.
Have you ever owned a real championship belt or even a replica one?
I've never owned a real one. I mean, as far as a belt that was used in the ring, by a promotion or whatever, a ring used belt. I do own a couple of replica belts that were made by Dave Milliken that were Reggie Parks' design. One is the Missouri heavyweight title, which I never got to see any of the St. Louis wrestling growing up, but, I read about it in the magazines, and that belt was always put over in the magazines at least as, the stepping stone to the NWA World title. And, of course, Sam Munchnick's promotion in St. Louis helped determine help focus who would be the next NWA World Champion. And so I always loved that belt. And even for years never knew it was blue, that it was painted blue, because the magazines were always in black and white. But at some point in time, Dave actually had made that belt for someone else and had taken it back on a trade or something, and so I wanted to buy it, and I bought it from him. I also have a Florida title belt, 80s version of that, and a Mid-Atlantic belt. That was the first belt that I bought from Dave that's how I met Dave, actually, was doing some belt business with him back in the late 90s. I had a replica made of one of the Mid-Atlantic titles, the more famous one. So I've owned a few, and I've sold a few. They're very expensive when you have them made like the real belts were made. And so I don't own as many as I'd like. I wish I've seen, I have friends that have huge collections, and I'm very envious of that, because they're just so fun to look at. And when made by one of the real belt makers and made like the belts were made back in the day, they're just beautiful works of art.
Now let's talk about your website, the Mid-Atlantic Gateway. That's been going since about the year 2000, so it's probably a little bit older than some of our viewers. How did that come about? It sounds like it was a real labor of love.
Yeah, it was, I guess how it came about, I had met my partner in the website is a fellow named David Chappell, who's an attorney up in Virginia, and this was right at the dawn of the internet. This was back in the 90s when message boards first started becoming popular, and there was a board, I guess it's still active, I don't participate in those much anymore, but it was called Wrestling Classics, and we were in the same discussion forum talking about an old angle. Well, actually, it was the angle I told you about at the beginning of our discussion here with the Anderson brothers and Wahoo McDaniel and Paul Jones. And I asked on the board, does anyone have any video of that? Does it exist or whatever? And David responded. We didn't know each other, but he responded he didn't have video, but he had audio of it, where he had taped it with an audio recorder back in the day. This was long before video recorders existed. So that's how we met. I was interested in getting a copy of that to hear that again, and we started emailing each other and got to be friends just because of our identical interest in the Mid-Atlantic promotion. And then I guess it was maybe 3 years later or so when we both realized all the material that we had, both in memorabilia and just general knowledge of the history of the territory, we decided to I actually just said, why don't we try a website? I knew nothing about putting together a website, and that early website, when I look back at it, is so primitive and rough looking compared to what you can do today. But that's how it got started, and we just slowly started rebuilding the history of the promotion, really as you saw it on television, not so much the behind the scenes. It's not there's no dirt on the website and all that. It's really just to relive the history of the matches and the angles and the title changes and the belts and all of those things through the years.
It really is a phenomenal website at the moment. The way that it's put together, the stories and the photos as well too. It's a really, really slick and really clever looking website. If people want to check it out for themselves, what's the address?
Well, thank you, Grant. I appreciate the compliments from you on that, and that truly is a labor of love. And there's more stuff on there. Before I give you that address, there's so many times. I have a lot of folks who pitch in and help with that now who have the same interest. One of them is a fellow by the name of Carol Hall, who I will occasionally ask Carol, do you have information on this particular angle or whatever? And he'll say, yeah, it's already on your website. And the site has grown so large and covers so much information that I forget what we've even put on there. So there's a lot to look at and a lot to enjoy if you like the old territory era and if you like the old Mid-Atlantic area in particular. But that website address is midatlanticgateway.com, and that's where you find links to everything that we do, including all the books. You can follow us on Twitter. Always, whenever I put a new post up on the Gateway, we link to it on Twitter, and that's at MA Gateway. So MA Gateway is the Twitter address. And we're on Facebook, too. If you go to Facebook and just enter in Mid-Atlantic Gateway, you'll find us there. So I'm not big on social media. By that, I mean I just don't utilize it much. But I have found out that it's a good way to keep people informed of what we're doing on the site. And so those are the two areas that we update regularly, and we'll tell you when something new is on the website. And I try to update the website at least twice and sometimes as many as 4 or 5 times a week with some new material.
Oh, wow. And the books as well, too. You can get them through the Mid-Atlantic website, but also Amazon you mentioned before as well, too?
Yep, Amazon.com. If you just go into the Amazon and search for 10 pounds of gold or big gold or United States Championship, those things will pop up immediately in the results on Amazon. You'll find the books pretty easily. Also, Googling those terms will generally put our Amazon books up in the high on the Google search results. But if you go to the Gateway, I mean, if you're interested in seeing I've published 8 different books on a variety of subjects, 2 of them specifically on the belts we talked about, and 1 on belts in the history of the belt, the U.S. Championship. But if you go to the Gateway, there are links down the right side to all of those books, and at the top there's a link simply called Bookstore, and if you click that, it gives you links to where you can purchase the book, either on Amazon. Some of them are available still directly through me, but most now I'm trying to steer all that traffic to Amazon, and that's where they're available.
Well, Dick, it's very rare to come across someone who has literally written the book on something, but that's exactly what we've done today. Dick Bourne, thank you very much for joining me on the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
Grant, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovyGshop.com. On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
Following on from our chat with Mr. Dick Bourne, let's keep things old school. On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast, we'll be taking a close-up look at a Nikita Molkovich cast NWA Tag Team title belt. In the meantime, make sure you don't miss a thing by subscribing to this YouTube channel, and you can join in the conversation on Twitter at Groovy G Belt Show or on Facebook. Until then, take care. It's bye for now.